And so when they came to us, they got on this medically prescribed diet, and we thought, I think it will do harm if we don't increase protein in both groups. So we convinced everybody that was what we need to do. And so both groups got a little higher protein bump. So they ended up at around 1,100 calories, still very low. And then one of those groups did resistance training. The other group did not. They did normal standard care, calisthenics. They came to a room, did some basic exercises like up and down and, walking around. Very basic. The other group did resistance training for 12 weeks. After that period of time, both groups lost a significant amount of weight because they're very low calorie diets. This is the cool part though. The group that did resistance training had a phenomenal outcome in terms of the composition of the body weight that was lost. And it was huge. It was the group that did resistance training only lost 4% of the weight they lost was muscle. The group that did not resistance train lost 25%. It was 24. So call it 25% of their weight loss came from their muscle.
Dr. Mike Ormsbee, this is some wild stuff, man. Is there actually an impact with resistance training being a fat loss tool, like independent of just building muscle, right? Like we think aerobic training, we think cardio is what's burning fat. We kind of just naturally think that. And if we think resistance training, we think, well, yeah, you put on muscle, so then you burn fat. But there's some research that's coming out of your lab. It actually says that there's a legit effect with resistance training and actual fat loss.
Yeah, 100%. Resistance training is a fat loss tool that we've got to take advantage of. I think when you traditionally think of resistance training, just like you said, it's like put on muscle, what are the programs, how can we get bigger, better, stronger? But what we do is we spin it because people are working on that lane, and we want to see how does resistance training impact fat metabolism.
So what did you do in this study? And let's kind of like back out some of the old literature that's still relevant, but like there's this thing like the EPOC, right? Like, you're burning some fat for a while after a hard workout. And that's one thing, but this is different, right?
Yeah, for sure. So I think you got to start there. The story begins with that original data. And maybe we talk about even, why do we think this would work? Why would resistance training be one of these tools? And so we know several things happen as a result of resistance training. You have this increase in catecholamines. So those will impact fat metabolism specifically. And we know there are several earlier studies showing resistance training against aerobic training. You have this massive increase in norepinephrine and epinephrine. So theoretically, that increase should improve lipolysis. Yeah. We also know that resistance training will boost growth hormone. Now, that's been sort of shut down as a mechanism to grow muscle, especially acutely. But growth hormone is also lipolytic. So maybe that elevation that we see acutely in growth hormone is really more something to aid in the lipolysis side. So that's interesting. We also know the original data and all the things that have come out over the years showing, like you said, increase in EPOC, this large increase in energy expenditure that can last for some days after training. So putting all that together, it seems like, theoretically, this should be working as a fat loss tool. And so that's where we really started our deep dive into that work and how we started to design studies over time.
So you were saying something earlier before we were recording about the muscle cells and the fat cells, or being able to essentially communicate with one another. Like there's a signaling process. Like what does that look like? What's happening in the cellular sort of metabolism after a workout?
Yeah. So really in the last 4 years or so, there's been an uptick in research looking at this space. And, for a while, fat was considered to be almost inert, like no activity. And then now we know it's highly active and it communicates with a lot of different places, but it still wasn't solidified really that you had communication between muscle and fat. And that was happening in a way that would be helpful for lipolysis. And so over these last couple of years, we've noticed several things. One of them is that the damage you get from resistance training from your muscle, some of those myokines and cytokines will actually impact your metabolism, your fat metabolism, to improve and increase lipolysis. So like IL-6 and TNF-alpha and these other commonly measured things are actually stimulating lipolysis coming from the muscle. And one of the really cool papers I've seen in the last 4 years looked at these extracellular vesicles that come out of the muscle, and they carry this molecule called MIR1, and MIR1 is a brake. It stops the brake on lipolysis. So it comes out of the muscle, it goes to the fat, it stops the brake on lipolysis, allowing it to accelerate. And so that communication is ongoing. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done, but we know for sure these tissues are communicating, and that resistance training is actually directly influencing what's going on with your fat.
After today's video, I put a link down below for LMNT electrolytes. They are not sweetened with erythritol. LMNT electrolytes are 1,000 milligrams sodium, 200 milligrams potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium. But that link down below gets you a free sample variety pack with any purchase of LMNT electrolytes. So whether you purchase their sparkling, whether you purchase their stick packs, or whatever, you get a free sample variety pack, and that's exclusively using my link down below. That is drinklmnt.com/Thomas. Again, drinklmnt.com/Thomas. Really interesting stuff. They curb my appetite entirely, but I also have them in a fasted state, and I sip on them during my fasted workouts because I feel like I actually get replenished, but I also get my cravings satisfied. So that link is down below in the description.
How long does the brake get let off? How quickly after resistance training? And where I'm going with this is, could one theoretically do resistance training, allow that brake to get let off so there's more lipolysis, and then go do cardio and get more benefit from cardio?
We don't know the answer yet. So there's still a lot to be done in terms of timeline and time frame and how long does this last. Based on older data looking at the oxidation piece and what's going on there and lipolysis, it looks like it'd be up to 24, 48 hours is what older data say. That's never been measured directly. But it's long enough that you would theoretically have a benefit in the next session. There's 2 papers I'm aware of where they resistance trained and then waited 20 minutes and then did an aerobic session and measured fat oxidation. Or you resistance trained, waited 120 minutes and then did your aerobic session and looked at fat oxidation. And the shorter duration, the shorter time, the 20 minutes instead of 120 minutes was more beneficial for that fat ox piece. So I think practically it makes sense. You're still kind of revved up from that first one. You're in a state to use it. You probably are taking advantage of sort of the double hit on metabolism through that space, and you're potentially using this mechanism coming from the muscle to the adipose tissue itself. And 120 minutes later, that's hard to pull off for a lot of people, where you wait that long and then go exercise again. For most people, that doesn't work unless you're a pro athlete or all you do is train.
Was there, so the first one was 20 minutes. So there was no feeding, I'm assuming. Between.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, you couldn't eat in that time. In real world too, if you had that long of a wait, 120 minutes, you'd probably eat.
Yeah.
So yeah, this whole piece is interesting because most of the studies are done in a space where you are fasted, because you have to control all these metabolic variables. But in real life, a lot of people don't show up to work out that way or don't feel their best in that sort of scenario. And athletes probably don't do that either.
Yeah. It's what is the inflammatory response, or how does the inflammatory response relate with fat loss? I mean, that's kind of something that I don't think a lot of people fully understand. They think inflammation, they might just associate that with, sort of that post-workout kind of inflammatory response as a necessary evil sort of thing. But how does that, from what you've seen, affect fat loss?
Yeah, I think we have to think of that from 2 different ways. The first one is, if we always squash inflammation with food or supplements or some strategy, there's data on the muscle side of this that's not great for muscle growth. And so that's interesting in and of itself. And then the newer data, like we just talked about, was that increase in inflammation, other than just causing you some pain, is probably helping restructure muscle.
Yeah.
But then it's also feeding into your blood and getting to your adipose tissue, which is stimulating lipolysis. And so it's possible that through the evolution of mankind, you've got a situation where if the muscle is damaged and hurt and you need some fuel to be coming in, you're liberating, on that side. That's all, just my thought. There's no data to show that, but that's kind of my thought of how that would work.
Yeah, that would make sense. I mean, have you seen that it's like the more demanding the workout, the more the fat loss effect?
We don't know in this type of that study hasn't been set up to see the type and how much and all that. A lot of it's from animal models that are then translated now, especially this extracellular vesicle work, that it should be working in humans. But the cytokine work has been done in humans, so that's an interesting space. It just shows me like our whole body response or systemic response to training is way more complicated than we thought. And I think it's really cool to show, like, if you are taking time to resistance train to even if it's purposely to grow muscle, it's having this fat loss effect. And so it just shows us, resistance training is fat loss training. It is a way to sort of jumpstart this. And some people don't like to do aerobic exercise. It's still the most commonly prescribed way for people who are getting a blanket statement. You need to lose fat or weight. What do you do? Go walk, go jog, whatever. And a lot of people just don't like that, particularly if you're carrying around excessive weight. It hurts. And it's not great. So in some of our studies, we've actually seen a lot of success where we had individuals with obesity do things like the leg press. And it's safe and it's structured and we have spotters, but they're good at it. And so immediately you get a win.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm stronger than that person. And so you get a win, and that brings a little bit of momentum to come back again, where you say, okay, I'm actually good at this. Yeah. I'm better than other people at this. And so those small wins, I think, help a lot. So resistance training can be quite a tool for it. And, a lot of times we think of it just in general, like if you want to change your body composition to be more muscular, change the shape, resistance training is your tool. If you want to be a smaller version of your current shape, aerobic training would be your tool.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you actually want to change the way that you physically appear, that resistance training piece needs to be part of it. And that's certainly from a muscle perspective, but also from a fat metabolism, fat oxidation perspective.
Yeah. That's super promising, because I think there's a lot of talk around VO2 max, longevity, VO2 max, and just fat loss in general, and kind of your relative VO2 max. And that's very unmotivating for people. Like that really turns them off, right?
Yeah.
I think even the sheer talk of VO2 max gets people that are overweight or obese pretty turned off, right? Because they're just thinking like, how the heck am I going to improve my VO2 max? It just sounds performance driven and daunting, right? And from a resistance training perspective, I think most people are kind of hung up on, it takes so long to build muscle. I'm not really getting the metabolic effect until I build muscle. And that could be months, years down the road. So it's like this delayed gratification, and that's not exciting for people.
So I tell you, like some of our original work that was looking at this exact thing, and we did a 12-week training study that included resistance training. The other group was aerobic training. It was also a protein feeding study, but some of the individuals in that study had a significant, impactful, positive change in body composition, but their body weight didn't change much over that time. And we had people that would literally drop out of the study, even though they're saying my clothes fit better, my belt's another notch tighter, but their body weight didn't change. It just showed me at that early time, this is back in like 1999, 2000, and we saw, I just was shocked that people really were just so driven by that weight only approach, despite all the positive changes we were seeing. So you're spot on with that. Like people get deterred if they don't have some success right away in the area that they want that success to be in. And so we built in wins with some of these where we do periodic testing for strength, because that's going to go up.
Yep.
Before you see other things. And so now we have a check-in at 4 weeks and 6 weeks and 8 weeks, for example, where you might have an advantage in some of the strength measures we're looking at. And not VO2 max per se, but if you're doing some of these strengths, and that's, I am getting strong. And so sometimes even now we still have to just stay on top of, this is a win. Look how much better you feel. The strength is coming on. And I think as long as we hit those markers, we can keep people entertained enough and sort of enthusiastic about keeping that momentum going.
What about from a myokine perspective? Like that's really fascinating stuff that I think people the mainstream is just starting to kind of understand and talk about. Like, do these sort of marinating in myokines for hours after training, like what other kind of metabolic effects do you see with that?
Yeah, marinating in myokines, I love it. Honestly, we don't know. It's such a new space. I mean, we understand that those have the inflammatory and immune response is incredible. That's coming from different types of training sessions, and it obviously is widely different between your physical status and mine and others and stuff. But in terms of the muscle aspect of it, it's just too early.
Yeah. We
don't know exactly the dose response, the type of exercise that would stimulate those things. But I think it's super encouraging to know that that pain you may feel, some of the markers we typically thought was just inflammatory and maybe that's a bad thing or a good thing. We know that's helpful now on the lipolysis side of this. I think that's really where I'm excited to see where it goes. And it gives me, we got old stored samples I'd love to look back at now and say, we didn't ever look at it from that mechanism. So when we started on this training, resistance training, And what is it doing to fat metabolism? One of the original studies that we did was we started like most people do in fit men, just an easy group to get at a college level. And one of my early projects was looking at microdialysis and specifically measuring where was the fat coming from and was it increased with resistance training? Because up until that time, there was only aerobic data. It was go do some cycling. Let me see what happens to glycerol in this technique. Does it go up? That's an increase in lipolysis. Then you oxidize it during the activity and back down it comes. And so I came along and was like, I want to do that in resistance training. Yeah. I want to repeat this, but with resistance training. So we started with this young fit men group and the data matched. It matched really well. As you might expect, you do the resistance training session, up goes the glycerol that we measure in the microdialysis probe in your subcutaneous abdominal adipose tissue, and then it comes back down over time. So we started looking into that more as a mechanism to improve fat loss over time. And so we decided to look at different phenotypes. So we looked at next lean or people with obese phenotype, and everybody was sedentary. So nobody was used to training, but they were lean or had obesity. And when we ran that study, no matter which phenotype you were, when you did resistance training, you had an increase in glycerol response, meaning you were liberating fat to provide fuel for that activity. Great. But why? What's happening? And so we started measuring different hormones and things in the blood that might be showing us why that's going on. And the only story that came about, well, two really, were what's going on with insulin and what's going on with growth hormone. And in those studies, growth hormone went way up in both groups. And so that's what we think is stimulating that lipolytic response. Because like I said earlier, like growth hormone, we don't necessarily think is really involved in that hypertrophy response acutely anymore. Yeah. But we have now, I think it's on the lipolytic side, and that's what's driving the change in fat metabolism that we're seeing. So that's an interesting fact. And then another group decided to put growth hormone into the microdialysis probe directly to see what happens to the tissue. And just like you'd suspect, when they perfused growth hormone straight into the belly fat, they saw that particular group had a much greater increase in glycerol, meaning it had a heightened lipolysis. So we are now seeing in several ways, like sort of an applied mechanism during the training, we see it and we see growth hormone go up. And then if you actually stimulate it with growth hormone, you also see this rise in lipolysis. So that was kind of the story that we were used to, plus the catecholamines rise, and the catecholamines stimulate the beta receptors on the fat cell. And so those are the receptors that we think are responsible for this increase in glycerol. And so norepinephrine and epinephrine will stimulate those. Those are that's the accelerator, the betas. The alpha receptors are the brake. Yeah. And the catecholamines can stimulate both the accelerator and the brake. And so in the aerobic exercise, the work that was done before we did anything with resistance training, normal response with glycerol from the training, but then they perfused a drug called phentolamine. And phentolamine blocks the brake and it should increase lipolysis because you're stopping the brake. And in those studies, it followed suit. They saw an increase with the perfusion of phentolamine. And that made companies that make products that might block the alpha receptor very happy, I think, at that time. But it didn't really work when they gave things like yohimbine and other things that do that. It didn't really pan out. Yeah. Now looking at these phenotype differences in aerobic training, when they gave the phentolamine, well, first of all, the obese phenotype had just a blunted response all over the place. They had lipolysis, but it was much lower than the lean group. And when they gave the phentolamine, they matched. So they had the people with obesity had a larger break, let's say. Interesting. And so when they gave the phentolamine, they were matched and they looked like the same type of glycerol response. So we did that in the resistance training side to see if it was the same thing on that end. Unfortunately, it wasn't. So it was the same in that resistance training stimulated lipolysis in both groups, lean and those with obesity. But when we gave phentolamine, we thought we would see an increase in glycerol in both groups, and we really only saw it in the lean group. So it wasn't matching what was going on. And so it to me just showed that the adrenergic receptors are involved, but probably not the main player in this.
That's wild.
It was. And so two things came from that, because we had to figure out why and what's going on. And still don't know all of it, of course, but the insulin was higher in the people with obesity at every single time point, which is another break on lipolysis. So that's probably involved as the total blunting of this. And the other side was that the growth hormone response was also blunted. It went up, but not nearly as much as the lean group.
Interesting.
And so it's this phenotype that's really pushing back against losing fat. Once you get there, it's harder to lose it.
Wild. So it's almost as though, I mean, in this case, so even with resistance training compared to cardio, this was still occurring. I mean, it was if they were obese, this was essentially getting blocked either way.
Right. Now, these studies weren't comparing it yet. They were just looking, once they looked at aerobic, the other one looked at resistance.
Got it. Is it, because that's trying to find a way that we can explain that in a way that might be, motivating for people, right? Like how do you, I think as we're learning more in many ways, that tells us like, hey, there's some elements that once you are obese, like it's hard to reverse that, right? So yes, when people say like it's harder to lose weight when you're obese, it's a viable thing. Like it's because you're already putting yourself in that situation. If you look at like time over time, like there probably isn't data on this yet, but once the obese person loses the fat, do you imagine that it would be the same as a lean person, or do you think that's a phenotype that like once it's established or a genetic thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are some data that are looking at people who have previously had obesity and are now not. I've never seen that run in this case, where you could see now that you've lost it, now what? Do you reverse it because you're back? I don't know. I think it would go back.
I would think so too. It's just like, how much of it is just the presence of adipokines and just like the presence of the adipose tissue in general. Like, I mean, having all this separate.
I tell you though, one of the, it's sort of related. One of the most interesting studies I've been a part of was led by a guy named Dr. J. Kim, who's unfortunately passed away recently, but he was excellent man, excellent study. He ran this study that I was a part of. And what we did in this particular study was recruited people who were going into the bariatric center for surgery. So you were going in to get up your appointments to have bariatric surgery. And instead they ran into the doctoral students and everybody running this study, and they said, hey, join our exercise and nutrition study instead. And so most people went around us and didn't want that. But we had some that came to us. And so it was a small sample size, but we still got enough people to run a neat study on. And if they came to us, they were given the medically prescribed bariatric diet, which back when this was going on, that's a very low calorie intake. It was about 800 calories a day. And then coming off of the diets they're used to, that's a massive difference. The trouble is extremely low protein. And their habitual diet, especially if you base it on grams per kg, is like 0.55 grams per kg. It's really low. It's not even up to RDA if you do it on total body weight, obviously, because they're large. And so when they came to us, they got on this medically prescribed diet, and we thought, I think it will do harm if we don't increase protein in both groups. So we convinced everybody that was what we need to do. And so both groups got a little higher protein bump. So they ended up at around 1,200 calories, still very low. And then one of those groups did resistance training. The other group did not. They did normal standard care, calisthenics. They came to a room, did some basic exercises like up and down and, walking around. Very basic. The other group did resistance training for 12 weeks. After that period of time, both groups lost a significant amount of weight because they're very low calorie diets. This is the cool part though. The group that did resistance training had a phenomenal outcome in terms of the composition of the body weight that was lost. And it was huge. It was the group that did resistance training only lost 4% of the weight they lost was muscle. The group that did not resistance train lost 25%. It was 24. So call it 25% of their weight loss came from their muscle. And so to us, I think that showed just the power of combining resistance training with protein intake to have outcomes where you save muscle, you lose more fat in that period of time as well, obviously because the weight's different, 96% coming from fat loss in this case. So really an important thing that I was, hope would get more press is like you need to be resistance training, and you should probably add protein in these scenarios where you're on a very low calorie diet. Like, it's not where not all your calories should come down. You need to put protein high and reduce everything else to drop it, and then add in the training piece if you want to save muscle.
What about if someone already has like a previous amount of resistance training? There's someone that is experienced with resistance training, but maybe still overweight. Like, is there, the element of newbie gains, right? Like when someone first starts training and they put on a lot of muscle and stuff like that, like that's one thing. But what about someone that maybe is working out a couple times per week, maybe has a fair bit of fat on them, possibly even obese? Like, have you seen a pretty big delta with that in terms of like bumping up frequency of resistance training? Any data on that? Or is it more so just going from 0 to doing something?
Yeah, our data and the data I'm aware of is 0 to 100.
Yeah.
It's not ones who are already trained or moderately trained and then adding it, even if they have this. Well, so this isn't with resistance training, but there is one example. We haven't published these data yet, but we're looking at triathletes, female triathletes who exercised a lot. And so they had to meet a certain minimum exercise time, and they had to be competing still in races. And then we brought them all into the lab, and we measured a whole bunch of tests on them, including fat metabolism using microdialysis. And then once they were through all the programming, we dichotomized them based on their body fat level. So not BMI, on their body fat level. And they're wildly different despite training a lot and very similar time of training. And when we did that, we still saw a difference between the two groups. The leaner group, much more robust lipolytic response. The group that had a little more adiposity, not even wildly. They're still training and competing. Blunted lipolytic response. So we haven't done that with resistance training, but that was one study that was we're still trying to write up now that I think is going to be really important, that it still impacts your body. Even if you're highly trained, your body still impacts the lipolytic response that you'll have.
Would your hunch be that influences performance in a way? Like if they're blunting lipolysis, like, and they're going long duration, like, is that perhaps, I mean, you start thinking, is that the reason why maybe some people can go long durations not being fueled and other people feel like they need to be fueled? And
yeah,
I mean, but I've never seen in my experience body composition, like that being body composition dependent, right? Like, I know lots of people that are very, very lean that will do, close to marathon distance with pretty much no fuel. And then I know people that are very lean that do it with fuel. And then I know people that, are not lean that do it either way. So I've never seen any difference, but that's where my mind kind of goes. I'm like, okay, if they're have a break on lipolysis to a certain degree, that's got to affect beta oxidation at a certain rate, wouldn't it? Like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think theoretically it makes sense for sure. Again, one of those situations where I don't think there's data to actually definitively support it, but it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think logically it would make sense that that's part of it. We really got interested in that space because I remember going to watch my first Ironman. And if you go at the 17th hour, you see everyone finishing. They have to finish in that amount of time. And the people who finish at that hour, it's cool. They hype it up. There's there's people calling your name out and telling about your history, but they look wildly different.
Yeah.
There are people finishing then that are super lean, and they're coming in very last. So there's, it's not like you expect.
Yeah.
You can be quite fit at many different body fats and shapes and weights and,
totally.
and things. But the only paper I've seen that looks at performance in this was an Ironman study. And it just plotted finishing time and BMI. And then, or body fat, actually, not even BMI. And it plotted that over time, and there was basically a linear relationship. So the leaner you were, you had a faster finishing time. Now there's a lot of caveats to what that means, but in general, you can see that as an outcome, that the body fat will dictate performance in some sports.
What about the outliers the other way? Like, at what point does being too lean become a detriment to performance? Have you seen anything with that? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, anecdotally, in teams that we've seen, people we work with, there's a detriment, especially if you get into like low energy availability and what that does to recovery and repair.
Yeah, even just as a signal. Right?
Sure. But I haven't seen a study run looking at the way low side.
It's a hard cohort.
Yeah, for sure. And some sports you might find a little more prevalence in that, but I haven't seen any good data on that.
Yeah. It's always intrigued me because I think about, I stay relatively lean year round, and unless I'm getting really low, like 5%, I don't notice a huge difference in my performance. But also, I don't really get up above like 9 or 10% hardly ever. So I couldn't really compare. But I also wonder if there's an adaptation at a certain point. Like if you've been lean for 10 years, or you stay at 6, 7%. I mean, some of these Ironman athletes are really freaking lean, like crazy lean. And it's like you said, it's very surprising because you see all body types. Like and sometimes it's discouraging. Like, I mean, it's like, you're like I work so hard and this person, and it's like but it's also really encouraging, right? You're like, okay, well, it doesn't really matter. But when you get to the elite level, you do see very, very lean people, and they're doing long duration endurance work. And it almost seems like maybe they've become more efficient at utilizing their own stores, and it's just easy for them to kind of stay there.
It's really hard to compare those groups, right? They're kind of totally different beasts. If you're at the top 10 finishers versus the last 10 finishers, it's sort of different life, different
totally
objectives and goals. Most of those people in the 17th hour, obviously the goal was to finish as opposed to win, and they're both great goals. It's just different ways of training and fueling for those things, I think.
Yeah, it's I don't know how much and this may be outside of your scope, in the world of like fat adaptation and sort of, perhaps in our mutual friend, Andrew Kutnick, he does much more in the low carb research kind of thing. But I would wonder, especially looking at your protein feeding research that you've done as well, like where like macronutrient composition would dictate sort of the response that you would get from resistance training in terms of lipolysis, right? Because there's like benefits to having more carbs when it comes down to growth hormone response to a certain degree. And it's a wild way to look at it. I don't expect to have an answer, but I'm curious if you've seen any of that. Like, okay, what is the effect of resistance training when it comes down to lipolysis if the macronutrient consumption or profile is like a low carb versus a higher carb?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly would make sense that if you have one approach over the other, will probably have different outcomes. A lot of that will be calorie driven.
True.
What's the total calorie? What's the protein locked in at? When you manipulate the other ones, I think the variables I'd be real interested in are recovery, performance the next day, as opposed to what's it doing to lipolysis.
Yeah.
And remember, like, people confuse lipolysis and oxidation all the time. And lipolysis is simply getting the glycerol out of the cell and the free fatty acids. Oxidation is when you actually use them for a fuel.
Yeah.
And so just because you liberate it doesn't mean it's great. That's actually why we usually don't measure free fatty acids in microdialysis, because they can be rasterilized quite quickly. Yeah. And glycerol is a little bit more stable because it doesn't go back into the fat cell. So that's why we measure that as a tool.
And I guess in like an endurance athlete, that glycerol can easily go through G&G and ultimately become a fuel source. So it's kind of becomes, and that's where I could see in a lower carb state, how if you get yourself to increase lipolysis and measure glycerol, then you could probably assume that under an endurance event, that much of that glycerol is probably going through gluconeogenesis and turning into fuel.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. You've got different ways to tap into it. We just become just so much more efficient, I think, at using these fuels and just being able to encounter these different roadblocks in racing or training or whatever by being lean. Like the leaner you get, the more you're going to be able to tap into these resources. It almost seems unfair. It's like you got to get over this hurdle that's really blocking your way if you have excess adiposity. And then once you do, then it starts to roll for you.
Yeah. I think that's what's motivating for people is because doing this for as long as I've done it and looking at all kinds of people, and you've been doing this for a long time, it's like, I don't think it's always linear. I don't think it's always like, there's they might have to just get through this hump of losing that initial chunk before 100%. Things start to change. And then it's like this massive whoosh that starts coming faster.
100%. I mean, like Bill Campbell does a lot of work with diet breaks.
Yep.
And like that work's really interesting. He spoke to my class about it this past year, and it's not linear. And he shows data like maybe it even shouldn't be, where you take a break and it maintains or even goes up a little bit and it comes back down. But that pattern over time was successful in at least the work that he's shown.
What is his? I mean, we could almost do a separate topic on that, but I'm curious just for the sake of this. Like, what was it generally like every 8 weeks diet break? What did it usually look like for him?
He's done several different iterations of that over time and in different populations. And so they'll, many times they've done just a few day break and sometimes they've done longer in that. But his research on it's really neat.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I think where people get hung up with a diet break is just the misconception that it's like a full-on break where you're just eating a bunch of stuff, right? I mean, it's pretty highly calculated, right? You're going usually back up to maintenance for X amount of time or slightly above maintenance just to kind of reset and then come back down, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's a little like in one of the studies we ran, we actually gave a full day off in that. And so on one hand, it was good psychologically because you say 6 days being pretty good, and then I can take a day. And what unfortunately that turned into was some people that worked really well. It was just a reset, but they didn't go crazy that day. It was just a little bit different. But where it didn't work was you would start to say, okay, well, instead of just doing, let's just pick Sunday off and you eat what you want, it was like, well, can I do Saturday at noon to Sunday at noon so that I get Saturday night? Yeah. And then that morphed into, well, I want to do brunch on Saturday too. So I'm going to start that at 10. Yeah. And then it kind of creeped up. I want to do something Sunday afternoon. So all of a sudden it's 2 days instead of one. And then that's where we saw people sort of getting off the train.
Yeah. Also your, BMR's decreasing. So essentially like the impact of a cheat day becomes if you were to do the same kind of cheat day every Saturday for 10 weeks, but you've lost 30 pounds, like the impact of the same calories on a cheat meal is going to be significantly more at the end of that than it would have been at the beginning because your BMR's dropped so much.
Right. And I think that some of that data, like you started with, is not all out. It's simply going back to maintenance and eating a few more calories. It's not eating anything you want.
Yeah. I think most people kind of learned that the hard way with like cheat days. It's just so easy because it's really hard to tell someone to do a cheat day and then 8 weeks later tell them to do, okay, have a cheat day, but go 30% less than you did in the beginning. So you go all out, but curb it 30%. Like that doesn't really work. Like if I have a cheat day, I'm going to town, right? So it's like doing that. It's almost better just to take a break for a little bit altogether and then go hard.
For sure. And I know I am of more of the philosophy of like, let's try to make this sustainable. Let's make this sustainable. So if you just weave that into your plan, it's part of your plan for sure. And then you don't feel like you're making a mistake. It's part of the plan.
Well, Dr. Ormsbee, where can everyone find you, man?
Thanks. This was great. I would love it if people would reach out on @Mike Ormsbee at Instagram. We can start there.
Right on, man.
Thanks. Brother.